All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our nighttime edition of Authors on Tap, where we host amazing writers in conversation with other amazing writers. I say nighttime because we hosted a noontime event earlier today from Paris, where we had Dennis Cooper in conversation with Maurice Meyer over Dennis's new novel, I Wished, which you can check out if you go to our website, exileinbookville.com, or to our YouTube channel. I'm Javier Ramirez, and along with Kristen Gilbert, run Exile in Bookville here at 410 South Michigan Avenue, Suite 210 in downtown Chicago. This is a special edition of Authors on Tap, a kind of pre-release party, if you will, as The Gilded Edge does not officially come out until this coming Tuesday, October 12th. Happy pre-pub day, Catherine.
Thank you.
Catherine Prendergast is a professor of English at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, a Guggenheim Fellow, and a Fulbright Scholar. Interviewed by NPR and New York Magazine, she has written on battles over school desegregation, anxieties over the global spread of English, and recognition of disability rights. Dr. Prendergast's previous scholarly books include Buying into English and Literary and Racial Justice. The Gilded Edge is her first work of narrative nonfiction. Originally from New Jersey, she now lives in central Illinois with her husband and son. So I'll be in conversation with Charlotte Gordon, whose newest book, Romantic Outlaws, The Extraordinary Lives of Mary Wollstonecraft and her daughter, Mary Shelley, won the National Book Critics Circle Award in biography. Her essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Slate, and other distinguished publications. Before we get started, I want to thank you all for tuning in, and we encourage you, please, to keep your cameras on, but mute yourselves until the Q&A portion of the event. Use the raise hand function, and Charlotte will be happy to call on you or type your question or comment into the chat, and Charlotte will pass that along to Catherine. Please feel free to place your pre-order for the Gilded Edge through the link in the chat, which Kristen will provide during the event. When you purchase a copy or copies, because the holidays are right around the corner, it will come with a signed book plate. Now I'm going to pass this along to Catherine and Charlotte. Thank you for taking time out this evening, and have a great show. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I want to thank Charlotte for joining me. She's going to be handling the Q&A later on. Charlotte is so important to my work. When I was first developing this, one of my friends at a writing retreat said, oh, she read some of it, and she said, you have to read Charlotte Gordon's Romantic Outlaws, which is the story of Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley. And it's a great work. And she tells these two women's stories in tandem. And I was like, oh, you can tell a story with two heroines, real life heroines. So I was like, that really was something I held on to. And thank you, Exile in Bookville and Javier, for having us. I just want to give a plug that they are new Chicago bookstore on Michigan Avenue right there. So if you're waiting for the train or you just got out of the Art Institute, they're in the Fine Arts building. Go find them. All right, I want to share my presentation with you guys. Hold on, I'm first going to share screen. We'll see if this works. Slideshow. Can everyone see it? It works, looks good. Okay. So if you've been to Carmel, you know this is Carmel Beach behind me. It's a beautiful, evocative location. And the story of it is that in 1902, a writers' colony was founded there by Bohemian writers from San Francisco. And that's what became now a very renowned resort and lovely place to shop with galleries, restaurants. I recommend going. I often quip that, you know how there's this saying that in sciences that the best project is to apply for grant for is the effects of champagne on lobster. So you have a lot of both around. Well, the humanities equivalent is I have to go to Carmel to study Carmel because it's that gorgeous. So I would just like to say, go visit. But I'm going to start you actually in history. We are at the tail end of the Gilded Age, and along with the explosion of wealth and technology, there is a lot of social movement. And there's this entity called the New Woman that arises. And there's this cartoon that's sort of lampooning it. The New Woman actually works outside the house. She has political opinions. She might be a suffragette agitating for the vote. She rides bicycles. She's comfortable in sport. The thing I noticed while researching, though, was apart from this very fantastic image, there really was no new man. In fact, in history, they never refer to a new man. So this idea of this guy who's doing the dishes, that doesn't seem to have happened. However, whoops. There we go. Another image that's more familiar of a type of new woman is the Gibson Girl, and named after Charles Dana Gibson, the illustrator who used to do portraits of women, and they all had this lovely updo. They had cinched waists, long skirts, kind of blousy tops. They were beautiful, they were captivating, but they were also confident. And so notice the raised chin. So these were in the magazines which were proliferating at the time, and women were seen as people who should be buying and consuming magazines. So it was a very influential figure. Closer to Carmel, the founders are George and his wife, Carrie Sterling. They were the first artists to live there and then recruit other artists. Now, most people talk about George Sterling because he's the guy and the poet, etc. And I want to talk more about Carrie Sterling, his wife. The first thing I want you to notice is how similar her pose is to the Gibson Girl in this photograph. I mean, it's almost like cut and paste. There's a lot of confidence about her. She is wearing the blouse, cinched waist, long skirt. She's among men, that's fine. She's her own captivating, confident person. And she really was. She came from rags when her police captain father died, left insufficient pension for 5 children. Mom started a boarding house on the Oakland docks. And through that, she decided she was going to marry up. And she found George Sterling and did just that. George Sterling was well known in San Francisco. They called him the King of Bohemia because he used to hang out in the cafes with the artists, usually picking up the check, reading sonnets aloud. They painted on the walls, but he lived this double life where he was also one of the, first auditor and then vice president of the biggest developer of East Bay real estate. They bought up tens of thousands of acres in Alameda, Berkeley, and they started this one region called the Piedmont that eventually became known as the City of Millionaires. To make this viable as residential real estate, they had to completely transform how fast you could get to downtown San Francisco. So what you're looking at is this 5,000 meter mole or pier that goes out train over to what was then in the middle of the background, Goat Island. We now call it Yerba Buena Island, and then another little spear. And then there's ferries that take off from there, take you very fast to Market Street, to the Embarcadero. And so Carrie started working for the Realty Syndicate where George worked, and that's how she met him. Her and her sister worked there as secretary. So she became part of this rapid transformation. He was also a member of the Bohemian Club. He's sitting there in the middle. Jack London is to his right, another friend, Porter Garnett, to the left. The Bohemian Club was one of the foremost clubs in San Francisco where business people rubbed elbows with artists. Their motto was, "Weaving spiders come not here," meaning we don't do business deals in this club. We just worship art. We're just all about the art. Well, that's not true, for one. And the second thing is, if you're thinking it looks kind of like a man cave, you know, they had this outing up in the Sonoma Hills, which is kind of famous for its debauchery, where they would have a play and a performance, but they also get, you know, legendarily drunk, push each other off canoes, dress in drag. Richard Nixon was a member, by the way. If you can find it online, all the huge members, Tootie Roosevelt, etc. So this was where George eventually became connected with the guy who would bring him to Carmel. They're very macho set. He was best friends with Jack London. In fact, Jack London once sent him from Samoa a dried clitoris earring. Yep. So he meets a guy who tells him, yeah, I want to bring Bohemians to Carmel because I've got some real estate that's not selling. And if you look on that map, you'll see Carmel is that red square. It's about a mile square. And to the north is Monterey. Monterey was hopping around then. They had next to it the Hotel Del Monte, which was lavish. And they had bathhouse and racetrack and everything. And if you notice up in that corner, the Southern Pacific Railroad goes right there. Okay, so San Francisco people could go down on the weekend, you know, wine and dine, go to the bathhouse, go to the track and get back up. So this guy thought, Frank Powers, all I have to do is buy this parcel of dirt 3 miles from Monterey, because I bet they'll extend that railroad. They said they'll extend that railroad. They really will. Well, guess what? They really didn't. So eventually, when you go to Carmel, you will see this. It is a lot of galleries, restaurants, and hotels. But at the time they went, there was hardly nothing. One hotel and a bathhouse. And Carrie and George had to build their house. Okay. This picture is often cited as the beginning of Carmel. It's George Sterling there sitting in the sand. That's Mary Austin next to him, Jack London, and then another Carmel guy, James Hopper. I've seen this photo dated, 1902, 1908. It's kind of crazy how it sort of becomes the beginning of Carmel, but nobody really seems to be able to figure out when it was taken. And the important thing that Carmel wanted to establish is that we've got world-class artists here. So they invited Jack London down. Jack London actually never lived in Carmel. He never spent more than a month there in his life. But it was important for them to photograph him while he was visiting George. So that's what they did. And here you can see the artificiality of where the shot was taken. That's the shot you're looking at on the right. That's Carrie and all the wives and children over there on the left. And there's Arnold Ganta in the foreground taking the shot. On the same day, they took a few other shots, like they got the wives and girlfriends in. This is supposed to be fun place, right? And if you look at Carrie, who's there on the right with the dog named Skeet, she's a little bit rolling her eyes because she sees how artificial this all is. And all it's becoming to her is entertaining a ton of people, cooking for them, cleaning for them, including the Londons, who she has never liked. In fact, I would say hated. So here's a behind the scenes shot of them on the same day. This one isn't in the book, but there's Carrie, who's in the middle, third from the left. She's feeding everyone, as she always is, from a picnic basket while everybody's having a good time, chitter-chatting back and forth. And George is drinking, because the reason they're in Carmel is because they think George will stop drinking and fooling around. It never happens. In fact, the more George drinks and fools around, the more legendary Carmel becomes. And so his job is to really show people a good time. This photo also isn't in the book, but if you're anything like me, you've kind of stared at it a long while trying to figure out if those are his bits in the shadow there, down there. I can't really tell. But his thing, when he would take everybody to Point Lobos and swim, kind of naked or almost naked, for abalone. They would bring them up to the beach. They would pound them for an hour to tenderize them for the grill. They would sing these verses while they did it. They would make up new verses all the time. This one is, some folks boast of quail on toast because they think it's Tony, but I'm content to owe my rent and live on abalone. Now, they all made up verses, but this one wound up in Jack London's book because he wrote about the Carmel crowd a lot. So there was a lot of reciprocity. They were getting something from Jack, and he was getting something from them. Now to the subtitle. Carmel was said to have kind of devolved into a cyanide cult. It was said that all the members of the Bohemian set had cyanide on their person that George had distributed. So if they ever got bored, they could off themselves, if the thrill of life had left them. The source for this is actually one person's surviving wife. Beyond that, I haven't seen anything, and nothing I've turned out really has substantiated that at all. But it sounds good. But it is true that George Sterling dies of cyanide in the Bohemian Club, 1926. Carrie Sterling, that's an older picture on the right, 1918. And below them is Nora Mae French, our other heroine, who is said to have kicked it all off by dying of cyanide in the Sterling's house in Carrie's arms in 1907. You can Google all that. That's not the weird part about the book. Okay. Who was Nora Mae French? She was, besides being just beautiful, there she is, with these sort of movie star eyes. She was an accomplished poet. She had published, starting when she was 11, she had published in every journal of the West. She had published nationally. She had published in the Saturday Evening Post, which had a circulation of 1 million. She was somebody, even though she died at age 26. Now, even before that, she was the grandniece of Henry Wells, who founded American Express and Wells Fargo, and the granddaughter of Augustus French, who was the 9th governor of Illinois. And one of the things I had to puzzle over is why, and she grows up in LA eventually, why she grew up so poor when she came obviously from such wealth. And that's one of the mysteries I uncover in the book, and it has a surprising reason. She is a wild child. She loves to spend time outdoors. She writes just compulsively and just throws these scraps of paper around the house. She camps by herself. She is working as a seamstress in the factory. She probably made those boots, those leather boots. She does not do the Gibson girl thing. She does not tame the locks. She doesn't wear the corset, and she doesn't cinch her waist that much. She mostly wears this khaki hiking suit. Not sure exactly where this portrait was taken, but anyway, at a certain point, she says to a relative, I know, she says, I hate to be reformed. I know I need it, but it is so uncomfortable. She falls in love with a man and moves to San Francisco after the earthquake. That is the man. He was there during the earthquake. And all I'll say about him is you'll get to find out a lot about his character, but nothing that would surprise you, given the fact that he's writing here next to a trench of recently dug graves. So this is a letter I found in the archives that changed the trajectory of my project, which had originally been about the men, and then I found this. It's a letter to her boyfriend, Harry Lafler, from Nora Mae French. It's in the Lafler archives. It's written while she's in San Francisco, but using his Bohemian Club stationery. But she's at her home, and she describes, very dear, I have been through deep waters and proved myself cowardly after all, for I have bought some strenuous drugs Friday night, took them Saturday, and am suffering delayed and welcome pains today. So she had become pregnant, and she needed to get rid of it. We start the prologue at this moment in her life. And when I found this letter, there's a lot you can just determine from letters, just from looking at them, obviously the stationery. The other thing that struck me is that her pencil seems to almost be engraving the paper. It's so dark, and it was very unlike her other letters. She was clearly in pain when she's writing it. And I thought, who is this dame who writes her boyfriend about an abortion while she's self-administering that abortion? After her death, which was covered nationally, there's these copycat suicides, and then the weight of the cyanide cult is laid at her door. And a lot of the book examines how that happened. But one thing I would say when I was looking for a home for this book, people were like, how are you going to write about these unknown women? And I'm like, they weren't unknown during their day. I've been staring at them on the front pages of newspapers now for years. And so my question becomes, how does one really become an unknown woman over time? And going back to that letter, one of the things I noticed about it eventually, but not at first, is there was a page missing. And every time I would stumble into these letters that mentioned Norme French or about Norme French, there always seemed to be a rip or a cross out or something that had been obscured from history. And that got me going. Thank you for coming. I would love to hear your questions now and just start question and answer. So thanks for coming this Friday night. If you want to see more, I would love your engagement at catherineprendergast.com. And I will stop sharing now so we can get back to the main screen. Ellen!
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I love looking at the pictures. There's also great pictures. And oh my gosh, there's Ellen. The pictures in the book are also amazing. I stared at them. And I mean, it's just such a gripping tale. And I'm wondering, I have a million questions, but I'm wondering if anyone has questions to start us off. Well, I mean, I wonder if you wouldn't mind telling us, Catherine, sort of the genesis of writing this book, because I knew nothing about it. And when I received the ARC, you know, well, I can talk about my response later. I was blown away by it. And I'm curious to know the story behind it. You said you started with an interest in the men, and then you read that letter and you jumped ship. What?
Yeah, so I mean, going even before that, I had an academic interest in why these writers' colonies were cropping up around the same time in America, all in the beginning of the 20th century. Yaddo, McDowell, all in the first 10 years, all with seemingly the same kind of people, kind of like what I call second-tier robber barons, Yankees. Why were they going into the woods to start, you know, these utopian experiments, as it were? And what I found was there was weird stories in every single one. I'll get to the rest eventually. But when I found this letter, it kind of broke that book that was a very academic kind of like overview. And then I was like, all right, one at a time. And I'm starting with Carmel. But as far as it took me even longer to switch over and focus on the women, because originally I thought there's not enough here. And I almost gave up. And, you know, because there's so much about the men. There's 6,000, you know, items on Jack London in the Huntington Library alone. So there's a lot there, you know, and you really have to, you know, scramble and go back and back and back a million times to find anything about the women. And sometimes it's very much occluded in the narratives of men. So that's what I did. And eventually I found enough, but also I had to decide that it was okay to do this. And I sat down with a history colleague and she said, you know, we have this choice when we're with women's history. Either we just write about men over and over, or we have to connect the dots. And so I decided I was going to connect the dots, but I was going to show you the dots I was connecting at the same time. So I made the decision to show you some of the archival narrative, the archival pieces I was finding. So you can look at the data yourself and go, oh, wow, what does this mean? This is odd, you know, and have kind of a kinetic experience of discovery that I had in the archives.
One of the things that struck me, and again, anybody who has questions, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but the thing that most struck me, besides the sort of gripping tale, you know, oh my gosh, suicide, cyanide, all of that, but what made me keep reading, since for me, it came, I didn't know the story, I didn't know quite who you were, I didn't know anything, is that what's so unusual to me about this book is the I voice that's right there from the beginning. And I love that you include yourself, even your son is in here. And you include part of the journey of going through the archives and part of what it means to research, you know, unknown women. I loved that. I thought it was brave and really, really unusual. did that just come naturally to you, or was that a decision that you talked about with others?
I talked about it a lot with others. I really wrestled. Ellen knows I wrestled, how to approach this. And in the end, it's sort of funny because when I think of it as a huge shift from my academic writing, but my academic colleagues were like, when I mentioned there's the Wall Street Journal article, and it said tenacious research with humorous asides. And they're like, oh, that's like every piece you write. And I'm like, oh, you're right. I do, that even in my academic research, I'm always saying, I'm always kind of winking and saying, look at this. Isn't this bananas? Because I find it bananas. I'm also interested in, I think people love the discovery process, and I don't want to give it to them like all wrapped up, and I really wrestled with, that it was saying like, I'm making a leap here, or I don't believe this person.
Oh,
But
I love when you say, I don't believe this person, or I don't trust this person, or, she says she wasn't trying to hire someone as a cook. I won't give anything away, but in fact,
right.
in her diary, she is. I mean,
People lie. And when I teach qualitative methods, basically the lead of the course, the title is Everybody Lies, just like House, everybody lies. And so you have to triangulate between everything. I'm looking for some kind of corroborating piece of evidence. And I didn't want to base this just on news reports, because as I show in the book, they lie a lot. And I was reading different stories about Nora Mae French's death, and like 30 different stories in the newspapers. You can't rely on them either.
well, it makes the book so much more than a literary biography, or, a dual biography, because it reads to me more like a sort of a quest narrative. Like we're on a quest, and there's going to be all sorts of mysteries that you're going to guide us on, and also misplaced things in the archive, hidden letters, where oh my gosh, I mean, it's like it's amazing. I loved having that layer, and I think it really makes the book different from, I read a lot of biographies are sent my way, and this really stood out to me because of your voice.
I did eventually, thank you, Charlotte. I did eventually ask my press. I was like, is this sort of breaking generic ground? And I worry about that because, when you're trying to get a debut book out there, they want to be able to say, this is like this book that sold. And I just couldn't figure out any other way to write this. So I am glad I kind of stuck with it, and it worked. And I had an extremely supportive editor in Cassidy Sachs at Dutton, who really, anytime I had a brave impulse, was like, go, and just encouraged me to go always in that direction.
We have a question from Carlo here, which is, this may be a very basic question, but how did you know you were finished?
Carlo, when you sell a book, they give you a year. So part of it was that, but in all seriousness, deadlines, of course, yes. But I thought at one point that I was finished. I'd written 300 pages, and then at the point where I'd written about the men, this is going back a few years, I thought it was done. And I'd had friends read it, and they're like, no, this isn't it. And I didn't feel good about it either. So always in a writing process, you're kind of forced back into chaos. And when you've invested so much, you're like, oh, I don't want to rip up 300 pages. And then you're like, I guess I'm going to rip up 300 pages. So I had kind of a heart-to-heart talk with Jean Thompson, who's a National Book Award finalist, novelist, and she's in the acknowledgements, because I sat down with her at lunch and I said, I just can't make these men redeemable. I keep sending this book out and they go, these men are just horrible. I don't want to read this book. And she's like, I gave up on my male characters years ago. And I was like, okay. And that freed me up. So then the anxiety was finding enough about the female characters in the book, because I'd always wanted to write about Nora Mae French, but there wasn't enough. Yes, right? Yeah. Full disclosure, Carlo is my roommate from college. Like, we lived in a suite together. So, I could live with him in college, and he was just perfect. So, he's a mensch. But yeah, so I had to go back into the archives and say, I didn't find it all. I went back to where I'd been. I found different stuff. And then I'd forgotten everything about Nora Mae French. I was concentrating on the Wells side of her family. There was a whole trove of letters in the Abraham Lincoln Library devoted to the governors of Illinois between her and her family early on, because I was like, I've got nothing on her early life. There was tons. And I was just being stupid.
That's an amazing part of the book. And I'm trying really hard not to put any spoilers.
No, it really made the difference. And Charlotte, you've been to Urbana, you know, it's an hour and a half down the road. It was the last place I looked.
So interesting how that works. Well, now I want to ask more about that, but it's so funny how sometimes the things you would never suspect are right under your nose.
Yes.
But my list of questions was one of the tropes that returns again and again in the book is the destroying of evidence, the burning of letters, the ripping out of pages. And I like very much that you call our attention to it, but I wonder if you talk a little bit about that, because I like that you share your annoyance and frustration in the book.
So yeah, these people, think of them as sort of like early influencers. Like we think of influencers as a new thing with social media and all. Their job was to write poems about Carmel, get them published, get wealthy people to visit, show them a good time, take photos of it, have the journalists come in, all of it. So they were very aware that their lives were documented. Even before Carmel, they were documented. People knew who they were. And so especially Jack London's, anything having to do with Jack London was really touchy because he got excoriated in the press for his divorce and then his remarriage to Charmian. So they would often tell people to burn each other's letters after reading them, which is so freaking annoying because you have no idea. So there's references to letters I know were destroyed, but I know happened because of other letters, which is so annoying. And then there's George Sterling wrote Ambrose Bierce, his mentor, like nearly daily. It was so subservient in terms of a relationship. And that's not the word I'm looking for, the obsequious. No, it's anyway, whatever. The word is, he really wanted Ambrose Bierce's imprimatur on his work and to be seen as the next Bierce. And so he courted him a lot. Now, I'd seen copies of those letters in the Bancroft which is in Berkeley. When I got to New York to the NYPL, the public library, there's the Berg archive, which you kind of have to apply. Sycophantic, thank you, Amanda. I don't know you, but thank you. I saw the originals and I realized the copies were heavily edited, some were misstated, and no wonder this chronology made no sense that I was trying to put together from the Berkeley archives. So there is a footnote about that. And the Berkeley archives were a little hard. I would say, look, this is not by this person. There's, da-da-da. And they would be like, oh yeah, whatever, and put it back in. Whereas the Huntington would be like, here, please write a note, blah, blah, blah. So it's a very different experience when you go and, you're getting to know these people very well and you have some insight into the archives and you're like, wow, this isn't what this letter really is.
Did you really write drafts that were featuring the men? I mean,
yeah, I did. They're terrible. You can see them if you want.
Ellen's nodding. You read them, Ellen? You were one of the
terrible. I just want to put that out there, but I'm sure the new one will be better.
It's much better, Ellen. Much better. Yeah. No, the old one was just like, I kept thinking I have to write about them because they're famous. And how can you sell a book? And the first agent I had was saying, okay, can you just write a biography about Jack London instead? And I would be like, this is his fifth biography. And really, do people care that much about Jack London? I know he's got there are Londonologists who are really into him, but he's just not that appealing when you get close to him. So I really had to go, then I realized, okay, I have to go all the way in the other direction because I do not want to do that. That's when I had a sort of moment of truth. But people want to, be like, okay, there are Jack London sells to a certain segment. Let's do that.
I think that's one reason why having your voice in it really matters, is because from the moment you enter the narrative, I trust your voice, and I don't know any of these people, but I'm going to go along with this person who is funny and smart and talking about the things I care about, like women's lives, women's stories, how they get buried, how they get hidden. And I can tell that this narrator is going to reveal untold stories to me. And that's a very appealing way to begin. And then your insertions are so great. I mean, can I say the funny part about where your son comes in?
Oh, sure. He just clicked off. Go right ahead.
There's one very funny part where he is, I think he's typing is he typing the funeral or the obituary?
Yeah.
It's like, wow, wait, is this an ad or is this like he has some remark? I can't quite remember what it is.
Yeah, he says it's supposed to be about this woman who dies, but it reads like an ad for Carmel.
Yes.
And it does.
It's so funny. And I loved that his voice was in there. And I loved that, I loved it sort of adds that, who were these people kind of tone to it. And which we need, I think, as we're reading this. And especially, I also love how you don't hide your outrage at how Carrie is treated. That I think that's very important. I think that's.
To be honest, I struggled to empathize with Carrie at first. With Nora May, friendship was immediate. With Carrie, not so much. And it was really my uncle reading that first draft when he was like, all these people are just they're just, he wouldn't know the word cosplay, but who are these rich cosplay bohemians, basically? And she was the only character he liked. And suddenly I realized, oh, you know what? My grandmother, his mother, grew up in an industrial boarding school in Ireland, poor, or, had TB, all of that, came to America, married up, did not romanticize poverty, not for 1 minute. And I was like, she's Grammy, and I understood it immediately then. I got it.
I think that we feel that as readers. I mean, initially, she's not one of the artists. She's not one of the writers. She's clinging to security, but you empathize with her. And then her mother's last words to her are so horrendous. And then how she has to take care of all those men up in Carmel. So again, I don't want to be talking about the plot, but I feel like I know people after the book. I think, oh.
Anybody who's come from an alcoholic family, you'll see a lot of the same traits, where the woman seems crazier than the guy who's drinking at a certain point because she's trying to hold it together. So
I think people who don't know the story or don't know who Nora French is, one thing I would say is how, and you say this actually a lot as narrator, is how modern the book feels, and how, I'm a historian in part, and yet I was still blown away by how everyone was sleeping with everybody. Everyone is, it's wild. And you at some point say it was like the 1960s,
Yes.
they really were outrageous and amazing to read about in 1907, 1908. And I think it's important for people to know that.
I feel like when I read your book, Charlotte, Romantic Outlaws, when I read about Mary Shelley and Mary Wollstonecraft, I was like, oh, they slept around.
They totally did sleep around.
I had no idea. And so, you can relate to them. And I think there's always these iterations of bohemian communities in which this takes place. And what I saw was also, related to my hippie past, where people kind of get into a system where everything's acceptable until horrible things start happening. And then they're almost numb to it. And the toll it takes is long down the line.
One of the things toll it takes on women in particular. You froze for a second, Kathy.
Yeah.
Saying that again.
Yes, that it is in any sort of bohemian groups, whether it's the 60s or Mary Wollstonecrafts or my own background as a hippie in the 80s or whatever, everybody's having a good time till this toll starts happening. And so I could and then they're like numb to it, and then they start feeling it down the line. But the women absorb all the consequences of the sexual awakening. Nora Mae French particularly, and Carrie by being, swiped aside. Hippie background in the 80s verified. Thank you, Carlo. Yeah.
We know from the afterword that it's in New York, right? I mean, you're in Columbia together. So is that right?
Yes. So at the time, though, I was dragging along my hippie crowd from New Jersey, which was like a petri dish. Everybody had dated everybody else, and it had this one, central character who, like George Sterling, everybody would move where he moved. They all live in Seattle now, like my high school friends, because he moved there. They moved to Woodstock because he moved here. Yes. So I feel like, oh, this George Sterling person I know. I mean, he's so charming. He's very generous in many ways, and he's completely irresponsible.
Oh yeah, no, I was done with him. As I watched Carrie cook and clean, and especially the cleaning, oh, I was so annoyed at all of them. Especially, do we say Charmian? Is that her name?
Charmian. Yeah, London. Yes, and she's someone who, it's hard. Somebody warned me when I started going into Jack London that women who write about Jack London get the Londonologists on their back a little, like the Ripperologists come after you for going on Jack Ripper. There's Hemingwayologists. There's just a thing, right? So there have been some women writing about Jack London, but they embrace Charmian as sort of this modern and really feminist person. And she was kind of a backstabbing bitch. So there's no part of the London crowd that's going to like any part of this story.
It's hard for me to believe that there's a big London crowd. There probably is somewhere, but I don't know them.
The Jack London Society.
Of course.
Yeah. No, there was, when I went to the Huntington, which is a beautiful place to do research. Most people, if you've been there, you've been to the gardens and museums, and it's lovely because you research there. I'll get the block button ready. Yeah, no kidding. You research there and you step out and you're in beautiful gardens, and there's, beautiful tea house and Japanese garden. It's wonderful. And also rich. And it's kind of weird that this railway money is where socialist Jack London's papers are, but Charmian ran out of money after he died and had to keep the ranch going, so she sold it all. But there was a guy I had lunch with there who was taking an entire year because he just wanted to saturate himself in Jack London for a whole year. He's the one who warned me, actually. So yes, people love Jack London.
Well, he is, you do a great job with him in the book.
Well, somehow, Charlotte, Jack London Society has not invited me to give a talk.
They're going to hate you because
yeah, it is very different. And I went to the Jack London Ranch and whatever. And it's, I do think he's a compelling figure, but he's also anti-Semitic, racist, and misogynistic. And there's no real getting around that.
I also love that. I didn't know that Macon was such a jerk, but that's a side. Now we're gossiping about literary stuff.
H.L. Mencken, who published Fitzgerald, he was kind of the kingmaker in the 1920s, and he's George Sterling's last close friend. Their letters are a tough read as well. So, I mean, a lot of these figures that, people want to read these biographies about, I don't know. It was kind of hard to be like, well, here's what they're like. I did pull punches on Jack London just because I didn't want to divert the book too much. Everybody sees this whole crowd through his eyes, but in the fact I wanted them to see it through the women's eyes instead.
How did you make the decisions that you did about the Carrie Nora? I mean, it's very hard to have empathy for the two of them. They're sort of pitted against each other, both in the popular narrative at the time, and then, their legacy. So how did you figure out how to actually tell the story structurally? Because for people who haven't read the book,
it's not out yet, so that'll be most people.
All right, so
Dylan.
I don't want to spill too many beans, but there is a love triangle here.
That's on the cover.
Okay. Oh yeah.
Yeah. You get that. So how I did it is exactly how you said, by recognizing in the times that they were given, they were pitted against each other. Like the men, you could be the ingenue And that's how they saw Nora Mae French, even though she published more than some of them. She was a perpetual ingenue and they'd give her editorial advice, which she would ignore because she knew exactly who she was. And I will say, one of the things that I liked about the Wall Street Journal review is they said that I did make a convincing case that her poetry is better than George Sterling's. That's a very low bar, by the way, but it reads very well. In fact, in the writers retreat, I'll let you know where I met Ellen. We used to read, after getting a little drunk, George Sterling's poetry and do a little interpretive dance because it's that bad. So
the title of the big one, like the Vine and the
Wine of Wizardry and Temptation of the Stars. It was very late and it was very these and thous, and he just missed that moment, and Nora Mae French has had that raw immediacy. The same sort of raw immediacy of Jack London's Yukon Tales that were drawing people in right then. That's what they wanted. They didn't want this sort of over ornate stuff. Right. So I recognize that they were given their roles, scorned wife, ingenue, that's it. And put on a collision course. And and that's all I can say. Spoilers.
It's a gripping read for people who haven't read it. You have great pleasure in front of you. I couldn't put it down. I read it, like this, like it was a totally fun and gripping and sad and funny book. But we also, I think we need your voice in there, Kathy, to help us laugh at times because a lot of the story is sad. And so, having you mediate it for us, I think is very, very helpful, as well as fun. Like I felt like I met a new friend, I was like, oh my gosh, she is so funny. Oh my gosh, she is so funny. Really?
I felt the same reading your book. I was like, oh my God, she gets it. So I will say, I did locate a kind of up story. It does end on an up note, someone else, but this is a problem we have in stories about women in history. They're all supposed to be galvanizing and good. But the fact is, that's not what women's history tends to be. Oppression works and people do get ground under. And Nora Mae French would have written a lot better stuff and later and more and been someone you'd read in the canon had she lived. So these are the real costs. And I feel like if we do not mourn what we've missed, we can't celebrate what we have.
I think there's something galvanizing, though, about reading a narrative like yours where you recover and redeem. And I think that recovery and redemption is what is very moving or poignant to read. That's the triumph, even though the lives themselves are tragic. They just are. Yeah. And so I think that's the way, at least that's what makes me hungry to read these things. I'm getting sort of, I don't know, it's not virtue, but I feel happy to be part of the recovery process. And I think all readers will feel that way. Like we're so glad to meet her and know her and bring her up, from where she was buried by these men and by the media.
Well, I think, when we were working on the book group guide for this, one of the things that we worked on was encouraging people to think about the women in their lives, the stories of, their ancestors that somehow got buried and, talk about that, maybe whip out the tape recorder, talk to great aunt or what have you. And, because I remember one of the sad things about my uncle was he threw away a lot of my grandmother's letters because, it's just, you keep letters from work, but they were just like, those are personal. There might be embarrassing stuff in it. But there's a lot of the meat of women's lives in there as well. And so that's kind of hard. And too much of that gets lost along the way. I would also say I want people to have knockdown, drag out fights about what happened the night Nora Mae French died. I leave it purposefully ambiguous. And I will say that my editor and my agent, the two people who know this book best, have two completely different reads on it. And I love that.
But we can't say anything because we don't.
No, we're not going to say it, but I'll say that I want people to fight fisticuffs about it. If you're in a book group.
Well, we're talking very much. I mean, I'm of course talking about it as a story and as, a woman's story, but it is of course a mystery also, Oh, Carla, do you have an opinion of your own about what happened? that
Oh,
night.
Carlo, so I've decided it doesn't behoove me to advance it. And so I really want to hear what other people think, when they look at the, what it was, where they could look at the documents themselves. So yeah, I'll never say. I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. I think that's the joke.
So it's, I think it's 10 of 9, 5 of 9. I have to ask the obligatory question that everyone always asks, which is, what are you working on next?
So as I mentioned, this is one of many colonies that were created around this time. And so I'm sort of bouncing around which of the other 3 I looked at originally I want to do next. I think I've pretty much focused on it. COVID has unfortunately made archival work very difficult. So I kind of put it on pause until, everybody's safe. I'm doing this book tour all virtually except for one stop in Carmel that will be, vaccine masked, everything, But I think that's really important. So I can't wait to get back in the archives because each one of these places has a weird and wild story that I will bring hopefully to you next time.
That's so even I can tell it's a good idea because I immediately want to know, well, what happened at Yaddo? What happened at McDowell? What happened to, so that's great. I know. I know you're going to find really good stories. Let me just check in. Does anyone else have any questions or thoughts or anything they'd like to share with Kathy?
Ellen, you got anything? No. Okay.
You missed your chance to plan it. I'm really sorry. We should have discussed.
Yeah, I was like, you're not on Facebook. I should tell you this is going on. Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. And please know that this is an interesting time for publishing. One of the things that Javier was mentioning was that my book release date got moved. It was originally October 5th. So that's why this is all of a sudden a pre-launch talk. People don't have the book. And thank you, Javier, for keeping it on the books anyway, even though we don't have the book yet. And so it's now October 12th. And the reason of that is because there's just barges upon barges outside the LA and San Francisco coasts. Carla, you're out in LA, right? And so there may be, in fact, delays in shipping all kinds of books. So buy your books now for Christmas. Buy them now, buy them in bulk. Anything you think you might want, order it now, whether it's mine or somebody else's.
No, it should be yours. People should read the Gilded Edge. And it really matters for a book's life to pre-order or go ahead and order because those initial weeks are really important for Kathy. So if you're interested in this book or you think it sounds exciting, buy now and buy a lot because it will make a difference in the book's life.
There will be an LA Times review and profile coming out, I think, close to launch. So look for that too.
Bravo, Kathy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charlotte, so much.
Yes.
Thank you, Javier.
Yeah, thanks
Appreciate
everyone
it.
for tuning in tonight and really buy to your heart's content. Go to our website, exileandbookville.com and purchase Catherine's book. And we'll be happy to send along wherever you're at in the States with a signed book plate. So thank you. Thank you guys so much. Thanks, Charlotte. That was a great conversation, great presentation, and good luck on Tuesday.
All right. Have a great weekend, everyone.
All right. Thanks.
Bye-bye.